Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I'm your hard-working but indefatigable teacher, Mr. Burton. You will need to watch this video and take notes as you go. You may need to watch certain parts of the video a few times to ensure complete understanding. This is your homework and I will check the notes tomorrow before we get started. I hope you learned something.
Okay, welcome to our next topic in the level of economic activity. This one is called the business cycle. What is the business cycle? It is a recurring fluctuations in the growth of real GDP.
The business cycle refers to the fluctuations in economic activity that an economy experiences over a period. It consists of expansions, or periods of economic growth, and contractions, or periods of economic decline. During expansions, employment, production, sales, and incomes increase. During contractions, also called recessions, unemployment rises, production slows, sales decrease, and incomes stagnate or decline. The housing boom of the 2000s is an example of the expansionary part of the business cycle. The Great Recession that followed, which technically lasted from December 2007 to June 2009, is an example of the contractionary part of the business cycle. The National Bureau of Economic Research determines the official dates for business cycles in the United States. It calculates that since 1945, the average expansion has lasted about 58 months, and the average contraction has lasted about 11 months. However, since the 1990s, the average expansion has lasted 95 months, while the average contraction has still been just 11 months. Investors who think they can time the market may be able to profit from business cycles by choosing the right stocks. Meredith knows that cyclical stocks, such as commodity and technology stocks, tend to outperform at the beginning of an expansion, so she tries to purchase them at the end of the contraction when they are underpriced, then sell them at a profit in the early part of the expansion. When Meredith thinks the economy is overheating, she buys healthcare, consumer staples, and utility stocks, which tend to outperform during recessions because of their stable cash flows and dividend yields. Many economists consider the business cycle to be a natural part of economic activity. Some economists, however, believe that if the central bank did not manipulate interest rates and the money supply, business cycles would be less severe or might even disappear altogether.
Alright, the business cycle is the relationship between real GDP and time. So over time, the actual economic output, real GDP, tends to fluctuate in these wave-like patterns. And in the middle there, we have a long-term growth trend. So if we smooth out that fluctuating increase in GDP, we'll have the long-term growth trend, which is average real GDP across time. Within these fluctuations of the business cycle, there are distinct phases. When economic activity, when real GDP is decreasing, we call this a recession or a contraction. When it hits the bottom of the cycle, that's a trough, and that's when economic activity is at its lowest. Real GDP is at its lowest in that point of the business cycle. As the economy moves out of a trough, it starts to expand, economic activity starts to pick up, real GDP growth increases. At the top of an expansionary phase, we have the peak, and a peak is where economic activity is maximized. So we have full employment of resources, businesses are producing at their maximum output, all the factors of production are employed, and all the factors of production are being used efficiently. The difference between the peak of a business cycle and the long-term growth trend, we call this positive output. Economic activity is above the long-term growth trend. And when economic activity is below that long-term growth trend, we call this a negative output gap. Recession, a key definition here, a period of decreasing economic activity, and this is also known as an economic contraction, a downturn. Now during a recession, unemployment is increasing, investment is decreasing, and we see more business failures. A technical recession occurs if there are 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. Trough, this is the lowest point of the business cycle. It's a period of economic activity during which there are lots of unemployed. We're not just talking unemployed people. Labour is just one of the factors of production. So significant numbers of unemployed resources. So not just labour, but land, capital, and entrepreneurship as well. There are very low levels of business confidence and a slowing of price rises in the economy. But never fear, sooner or later economies do emerge from a recession into a period of economic growth and expansion, or an economic recovery. It's a recurring fluctuation of the business cycle. The expansionary phase, this is a period of increasing economic activity during which unemployment begins to fall. Again, this is unemployment of all the resources in the economy, not just labour. Land, labour, capital, and entrepreneurship are all increasing. There's lots of investment taking place and prices begin to pick up. So that's average prices. The price level in the economy begins to pick up pace. The peak of the business cycle. Now this is a period of very active economic activity. GDP, real GDP growth is at its maximum. It's growing at its fastest rate. At the peak of a business cycle, unemployment is at its lowest, investment is at its highest, and an economy experiences the largest rate of increases in the price levels, the average prices of goods and services. Okay, a key point about the business cycle, it is a recurring fluctuation. So peak follows expansion, recession follows peak, trough follows recession, etc, etc, etc. It's a recurring cycle in the growth of real GDP. So there are periods where there's lots of economic growth, periods where there's slowing economic growth, periods where there's very slow economic growth, periods where they're negative, where economic growth turns negative. An alternating period of expansions and contractions. This is the business cycle. The output gap, we've touched on it briefly before. So we have real GDP on one axis, time on the other. Actual output, this is the business cycle, actual output is this recurring pattern of fluctuating GDP, real GDP growth. Now if we smooth that out or average that out across time, we have a long-term growth trend, and that's the average increase in real GDP growth across time. So across time, average economic growth does increase. If the increases and decreases are smoothed out or averaged, a long-term trend emerges, and over time GDP, real GDP, increases over relatively long periods of time. The average increase over time is known by the long-term growth trend line of the economy, and we refer to this as a potential output of an economy. The actual output, of course, is what the economy is producing at any given point in time, and these tend to fluctuate. Fluctuations in economic activity that occur to an economy across a relevant time period. So as we can see below, the actual output, actual real GDP, from quarter to quarter, year to year, fluctuates above and below the long-term trend line of potential economic output. We talk about a positive output gap. when actual GDP is greater than potential GDP. When the economy is operating in a positive output gap, the economy is operating above full capacity. So there's full employment of the factors of production, and we begin to see an upward pressure on prices. Sort of the opposite with a negative output gap. Actual GDP is lower than the potential GDP. The economy is operating below full capacity. So there's spare capacity, underemployment of the factors of production, underemployment of land, labour, capital and entrepreneurship, and we see a downward pressure on prices, which will be important when we look at inflation and deflation later. So here's a key statement which is great for you to get through in your answers when you're talking about the output cap. Essential statement: a positive output cap occurs when actual output is above an economy's long-term potential and there's a little to no spare capacity in the economy. The opposite, a negative output gap, occurs when actual output is below an economy's long-term potential and there is spare capacity in an economy to increase output. More factors of production can be used to produce more goods and services. Now we need to make a distinction here between a decrease in GDP and a decrease in GDP growth. So a decrease in GDP is when actual GDP turns negative, right? There's a decrease in the number and value of output that the economy is producing. So increases in real GDP, quarter by quarter, in blue there, above the line, and decreases in real GDP in red there, below the line, in negative territory. Increases in the rate of real GDP growth are shown here. So the economy is growing faster, so from 1% to 3% to 5%. And decreases in the rate of real GDP growth. The economy is still growing, the economy is still in positive territory, but the rate of growth, that percentage increase, begins to fall. So at the peak of the cycle there, perhaps real GDP growth was 5%. The next quarter along, perhaps it's 3%. So the economy is still growing, but the rate of increase is slowing. So an essential statement here: a decrease in GDP is when the rate of economic growth is negative. That's key. A decrease in the rate of economic growth occurs when increases in real GDP are positive but increasing at a diminishing rate. The business cycle.